Hello there. I'm your imaginary friend. Today, I think we may finish up Undine by Friedrich de la Motte Fouqué. I've really been enjoying this story, and I hope you have as well. Now, if you have not seen the first of these readings, please go start with that one. And then there's been a second and a third, and this is hopefully the final one. This is chapter 8. After this last adventure, they lived at the castle undisturbed and in peaceful enjoyment. The knight was more and more impressed with the heavenly goodness of his wife, which she had so nobly shown by her instant pursuit and by the rescue she had effected in the Black Valley, where the power of Culeborn again commenced. Undine herself enjoyed that peace and security which never fails the soul as long as it knows distinctly that it is on the right path. And besides, in the newly awakened love and regard of her husband, a thousand gleams of hope and joy shone upon her. Bertalda, on the other hand, showed herself grateful, humble, and timid, without taking to herself any merit for so doing. Whenever Huldbrand or Undine began to explain to her their reasons for covering the fountain, or their adventures in the Black Valley, she would earnestly entreat them to spare her the recital, for the recollection of the fountain occasioned her too much shame, and that of the Black Valley too much terror. She learned nothing more about either of them, and what would she have gained from more knowledge? Peace and joy had visibly taken up their abode at Castle Ringstetten. They enjoyed their present blessings in perfect security, and now imagined that life could produce nothing but pleasant flowers and fruits. In this happiness winter came and passed away, and spring, with its foliage of tender green and its heaven of softest blue, succeeded to gladden the hearts of the three inmates of the castle. The season was in harmony with their minds, and their minds imparted their own hues to the season. What wonder, then, that its storks and swallows inspired them also with a disposition to travel. On a bright morning, while they were wandering down to one of the sources of the Danube, Huldbrand spoke of the magnificence of this noble stream, how it continued swelling as it flowed through countries enriched by its waters, with what splendor Vienna rose and sparkled on its banks, and how it grew lovelier and more imposing throughout its progress. "It must be glorious to track its course down to Vienna," Bertalda exclaimed with warmth, but immediately resuming the humble and modest demeanour she had recently shown, she paused and blushed in silence. This much moved Undine, and with the liveliest wish to gratify her friend, she said, "What hinders our taking this little voyage?" Bertalda leapt up with delight, and the two friends at the same moment began painting this enchanting voyage on the Danube in the most brilliant colours. Huldbrand, too, agreed to the project with pleasure, only he once whispered, with something of alarm, in Undine's ear, "But at that distance Culeborn becomes possessed of his power again." "Let him come, let him come," she answered with a laugh. "I shall be there, and he dares do none of his mischief in my presence." Thus was the last impediment removed. They prepared for the expedition, and soon set out upon it with lively spirits and the brightest hopes. But be not surprised, O man, if events almost always happen very differently from what you expect. That malicious power which lies in ambush for our destruction delights to lull its chosen victim asleep with sweet songs and golden delusions, while on the other hand the messenger of heaven often strikes sharply at your door to alarm and awaken us. During the first days of their passage down the Danube, they were unusually happy. The further they advanced upon the waters of this proud river, the views became more and more fair. But amid scenes otherwise most delicious, and from which they had promised themselves the purest delight, the stubborn Culeborn, dropping all disguise, began to show his power of annoying them. He had no other means of doing this, indeed, than by tricks, for Undine often rebuked the swelling waves or the contrary winds, and then the insolence of the enemy was instantly humbled and subdued. But his attacks were renewed, and Undine's reproofs again became necessary, so that the pleasure of the fellow travellers was completely destroyed. The boatmen, too, were continually whispering to one another in dismay, and eyeing their three superiors with distrust, while even the servants began more and more to form dismal surmises, and to watch their master and mistress with looks of suspicion. Huldbrand often said in his own mind, This comes when like marries not like, when a man forms an unnatural union with a sea maiden. Excusing himself, as we all love to do, he would add, I did not in fact know that she was a maid of the sea. It's my misfortune that my steps are haunted and disturbed by the wild humours of her kindred. But it is not my crime. By reflections like these, he felt himself in some measure strengthened. But on the other hand, he felt the more ill humour, almost dislike, towards Undine. He would look angrily at her, and the unhappy wife but too well understood his meaning. One day, grieved by this unkindness, as well as exhausted by her unremitted exertions to frustrate the artifices of Culeborn, she toward evening fell into a deep slumber, rocked and soothed by the gentle motion of the bark. But hardly had she closed her eyes when every person in the boat, in whatever direction he might look, saw the head of a man, frightful beyond imagination. Each head rose out of the waves, not like that of a person swimming, but quite perpendicular, as if firmly fastened to the watery mirror, yet moving on with the bark. Everyone wished to show to his companion what terrified himself, and each perceived the same expression of horror on the face of the other. Only hands and eyes were directed to a different quarter, as if to a point where the monster, half laughing and half threatening, rose opposite to each. When, however, they wished to make one another understand the sight, and all cried out, Look there! No, there! The frightful heads all became visible to each, and the whole river around the boat swarmed with the most horrible faces. All raised a scream of terror at the sight, and Undine started from sleep. As she opened her eyes, the deformed visages disappeared, but Huldbrand was made furious by so many hideous visions. He would have burst out in wild imprecations had not Undine, with the meekest looks and gentlest tone of voice, said, For God's sake, my husband, do not express displeasure against me here. We are on the water. The knight was silent, and sat down absorbed in deep thought. Undine whispered in his ear, Would it not be better, my love, to give up this foolish voyage and return to Castle Ringstetten in peace? But Huldbrand murmured wrathfully, So I must become a prisoner in my own castle, and not be allowed to breathe a moment but while the fountain is covered? Would to heaven that your cursed kindred... Then Undine pressed her fair hand on his lips caressingly. He said no more, but in silence pondered on all that Undine had before said. Bertalda, meanwhile, had given up herself to a crowd of thronging thoughts. Of Undine's origin she knew a good deal, but not the whole, and the terrible Culeborn especially remained to her an awful and impenetrable mystery. Never indeed had she once heard his name. Musing upon these wondrous things, she unclasped, without being fully conscious of what she was doing, a golden necklace which Huldbrand, on one of the preceding days of their passage, had bought for her of a travelling trader, and she was now letting it float in sport just over the surface of the stream, while in her dreamy mood she enjoyed the bright reflection it threw on the water, so clear beneath the glow of evening. That instant a huge hand flashed suddenly up from the Danube, seized the necklace in its grasp, and vanished with it beneath the flood. Bertalda shrieked aloud, and a scornful laugh came pealing up from the depth of the river. The knight could now restrain his wrath no longer. He started up, poured forth a torrent of reproaches, heaped curses upon all who interfered with his friends and troubled his life, and dared them all, water spirits or mermaids, to come within the sweep of his sword. Bertalda, meantime, wept for the loss of the ornament so very dear to her heart, and her tears were to Huldbrand as oil poured upon the flame of his fury, while Undine held her hand over the side of the boat, dipping it in the waves, softly murmuring to herself, and only at times interrupting her strange, mysterious whisper to entreat her husband, Do not reprove me here, beloved, and blame all others as you will, but not me. You know why. And in truth, though he was trembling with excessive passion, he kept himself from any word directly against her. She then brought up in her wet hand, which she had been holding under the waves, a coral necklace of such exquisite beauty, such sparkling brilliancy, as dazzled the eyes of all who beheld it. Take this, said she, holding it out kindly to Bertalda. I have ordered it to be brought to make some amends for your loss. so do not grieve any more, poor child." But the knight rushed between them, and snatching the beautiful ornament out of Undine's hand, hurled it back into the flood, and, mad with rage, exclaimed, "So then, you still have a connection with them? In the name of all witches, go and remain among them with your presence, you sorceress, and leave us human beings in peace." With fixed but streaming eyes, poor Undine gazed on him, her hand still stretched out, just as when she had so lovingly offered her brilliant gift to Bertalda. She then began to weep more and more, as if her heart would break, like an innocent tender child cruelly aggrieved. At last, wearied out, she said, "Farewell, dearest. Farewell. They shall do you no harm. Only remain true, that I may have power to keep them from you. But I must go hence, even in this early youth. Oh, woe! Woe! What have you done? Oh, woe! Woe!" And she vanished over the side of the boat. Whether she plunged into the stream, or whether, like water melting into water, she flowed away with it, they knew not, but her disappearance was like both, and neither. But she was lost in the Danube instantly and completely. Only little waves were yet whispering, sobbing, around the boat, and they could almost be heard to say, "Oh, woe! Woe! Ah, remain true! Oh, woe!" But Huldbrand, in a passion of burning tears, threw himself upon the deck of the bark, and a deep swoon soon wrapped the wretched man in a blessed forgetfulness of misery. Shall we call it a good or an evil thing that our mourning has no long duration? I mean that deep mourning which comes from the very well springs of our being, which so becomes one with the lost objects of our love that we hardly realize their loss, while our grief devotes itself religiously to the honoring of their image, until we reach that bourne which they have already reached. Truly all good men observe in a degree this religious devotion, but yet it soon ceases to be that first deep grief. Other and new images throng in, until, to our sorrow, we experience the vanity of all earthly things. Therefore, I must say, alas, that our mourning should be of such duration, such short duration. The Lord of Ringstetten experienced this, but whether for his good we shall discover in the sequel of this history. At first he could do nothing but weep as bitterly as the poor gentle Undine had wept when he snatched out of her hand that brilliant ornament with which she so kindly wished to make amends for Bertalda's loss. Then he stretched his hand out as she had done, and wept again like her with renewed violence. He cherished a secret hope that even the springs of life would at last become exhausted by weeping. And has not the like thought passed through the minds of many of us with a painful pleasure in times of sore affliction? Bertalda wept with him, and they together lived a long while at the castle of Ringstetten in undisturbed quiet, honoring the memory of Undine, and having almost wholly forgotten their former attachment. And therefore the good Undine about this time often visited Huldbrand's dreams. She soothed him with soft and affectionate caresses, and went away again, weeping in silence, so that when he awoke, he sometimes knew not how his cheeks came to be so wet, whether it was caused by her tears or only by his own. But as time advanced, these visions became less frequent, and the sorrow of the night less keen. Still he might never, perhaps, have entertained any other wish than thus quietly to think of Undine and to speak of her, had not the old fisherman arrived unexpectedly at the castle, and earnestly insisted upon Bertalda's returning with him, as his child. He had received information of Undine's disappearance, and he was not willing to allow Bertalda to continue longer at the castle with the widowed knight. "For," said he, "whether my daughter loves me or not is at present what I care not to know, but her good name is at stake, and where that is the case, nothing else may be thought of." This resolution of the old fisherman, and the fearful solitude that on Bertalda's departure threatened to oppress the knight in every hall and passage of the deserted castle, brought to light what had disappeared in his sorrow for Undine. I mean, his attachment to the fair Bertalda. This he made known to her father. The fisherman had many objections to make to the proposed marriage. The old man had loved Undine with exceeding tenderness, and it was doubtful to his mind that the mere disappearance of his beloved child could be properly viewed as her death. But were it even granted that her corpse were lying stiff and cold at the bottom of the Danube, or swept away by the current to the ocean, still Bertalda had some share in her death, and it was unfitting for her to step into the place of the poor injured wife. The fisherman, however, had felt a strong regard also for the knight. This and the entreaties of his daughter, who had become much more gentle and respectful, as well as her tears for Undine, all exerted their influence, and he must at last have been forced to give up his opposition, for he remained at the castle without objection, and a messenger was sent off express to Father Heilmann, who in former and happier days had united Undine and Huldbrand, requesting him to come and perform the ceremony at the knight's second marriage. Hardly had the holy man read through the letter from the Lord of Ringstetten ere he set out upon the journey, and made much greater dispatch on his way to the castle than the messenger from it had made on reaching him. Whenever his breath failed him in his rapid progress, or his old limbs ached with fatigue, he would say to himself, "Perhaps I shall be able to prevent a sin. Then sink not, withered body, before I arrive at the end of my journey." And with renewed vigor he pressed forward, hurrying on without rest or repose, until late one evening he entered the shady courtyard of the castle of Ringstetten. The betrothed were sitting side by side under the trees, and the aged fisherman, in a thoughtful mood, sat near them. The moment they saw Father Heilmann, they rose with a spring of joy, and pressed round him with eager welcome. But he, in a few words, asked the bridegroom to return with him into the castle, and when Huldbrand stood mute with surprise, and delayed complying with his earnest request, the pious preacher said to him, "I do not know why I should want to speak to you in private. What I have to say as much concerns Bertalda and the fisherman as yourself, and what we must at some time hear, it is best to hear as soon as possible. Are you then so very certain, Knight Huldbrand, that your first wife is actually dead? I can hardly think it. I will say nothing, indeed, of the mysterious state in which she may now be existing. I know nothing of it with certainty, but that she was a most devoted and faithful wife is beyond all dispute, and for 14 nights past she has appeared to me in a dream, standing at my bedside, wringing her tender hands in anguish, and sighing out, 'Ah, prevent him, dear father. I'm still living. I'll save his life, save his soul.' I did not understand what this vision of the night could mean. Then came your messenger, and I have now hastened hither, not to unite, but as I hope to separate what ought not to be joined together. Leave her, Huldbrand. Leave him, Bertalda. He still belongs to another, and do you not see on his pale cheek his grief for his lost wife? That is not the look of a bridegroom, and the spirit says to me, if you do not leave him, you will never be happy." The three felt in their inmost hearts that Father Heilmann spoke the truth, but they would not believe it. Even the old fisherman was so infatuated that he thought it could not be otherwise than as they had latterly settled amongst themselves. They all, therefore, with a determined and gloomy eagerness, struggled against the representations and warnings of the priest, until, shaking his head and oppressed with sorrow, he finally quitted the castle, not choosing to accept their offered shelter even for a single night, or indeed so much as to taste a morsel of the refreshment they brought him. Huldbrand persuaded himself, however, that the priest was a mere visionary, and sent at daybreak to a monk of the nearest monastery, who, without scruple, promised to perform the ceremony in a few days. Chapter 9. It was between night and dawn of day that Huldbrand was lying on his couch, half waking and half sleeping. Whenever he attempted to compose himself to sleep, a terror came upon him and scared him, as if his slumbers were haunted with spectres. But he made an effort to rouse himself fully. He felt fanned as by the wings of a swan, and lulled as by the murmuring of waters, till in sweet confusion of the senses he sank back into his state of half-consciousness. At last, however, he must have fallen perfectly asleep, for he seemed to be lifted up by wings of the swans, and to be wafted far away over land and sea, while their music swelled on his ear most sweetly. The music of the swan! The song of the swan! He could not but repeat to himself every moment. Is it not a sure foreboding of death? Probably, however, it had yet another meaning. All at once he seemed to be hovering over the Mediterranean Sea. The swan sang melodiously in his ear that this was the Mediterranean Sea, and while he was looking down upon the waves, they became transparent as crystal, so that he could see through them to the very bottom. At this a thrill of delight shot through him, for he could see Undine, where she was sitting beneath the clear crystal dome. It is true, she was weeping very bitterly, and looked much sadder than in those happy days when they lived together at the castle of Ringstetten, both on their arrival and afterward, just before they set out upon their fatal passage down the Danube. The knight could not help thinking upon all this with deep emotion, but it did not appear that Undine was aware of his presence. Culeborn had meanwhile approached her, and was about to reprove her for weeping, when she drew herself up and looked upon him with an air so majestic and commanding that he almost shrank back. "Although I now dwell here, beneath the waters," said she, "yet I have brought my soul with me, and therefore I may weep, little as you can know what such tears are. They are blessed, as everything is blessed to one gifted with a true soul." He shook his head incredulously, and after some thought replied, "And yet, niece, you are subject to our laws, as a being of the same nature with ourselves, and should he prove unfaithful to you and marry again, you are obliged to take away his life." "He remains a widower to this very hour," replied Undine, "and I am still dear to his sorrowful heart." "He is, however, betrothed," said Culeborn, with a laugh of scorn, "and let only a few days wear away, and then comes the priest with his nuptial blessing, and then you must go up to the death of the husband with 2 wives." "I have not the power," returned Undine with a smile. "I have sealed up the fountain securely against myself and all of my race." "Still, should he leave his castle," said Culeborn, "or should he once allow the fountain to be uncovered, what then? For he thinks little enough of these things." "For that very reason," said Undine, still smiling amid her tears, "for that very reason, he is at this moment hovering in spirit over the Mediterranean Sea, and dreaming of the warning which our discourse gives him. I thoughtfully planned all this." That instant Culeborn, inflamed with rage, looked up at the knight, wrathfully threatened him, stamped on the ground, and then shot like an arrow beneath the waves. He seemed to swell in his fury to the size of a whale. Again the swans began to sing, to wave their wings and fly. The knight seemed to soar away over mountains and streams, and at last to alight at Castle Ringstetten, and to awake on his couch. Upon his couch he actually did awake, and his attendant, entering at the same moment, informed him that Father Heilmann was still lingering in the neighbourhood, that he had the evening before met with him in the forest, where he was sheltering himself under a hut which he had formed by interweaving the branches of trees and covering them with moss and fine brushwood, and that to the question, what was he doing there, since he would not give the marriage blessing, his answer was, "There are many other blessings than those given at marriages, and though I did not come to officiate at the wedding, I may still officiate at a very different solemnity. All things have their seasons. We must be ready for them all. Besides, marrying and mourning are by no means so very unlike, as everyone not wilfully blinded must know full well." The knight made many bewildered reflections on these words, and on his dream. But it is very difficult to give up a thing which we have once looked upon as certain. So all continued as had been arranged previously. Should I relate to you how passed the marriage feast at Castle Ringstetten, it would be as if you saw a heap of bright and pleasant things, but all overspread with a black mourning crape, through whose darkening veil their brilliancy would appear but a mockery of the nothingness of all earthly joys. It was not that any spectral delusion disturbed the scene of festivity, for the castle, as we well know, had been secured against the mischief of water spirits, but the knight, the fisherman, and all the guests were unable to banish the feeling that the chief personage of the feast was still wanting, and that this chief personage could be no other than the gentle and beloved Undine. Whenever a door was heard to open, all eyes were involuntarily turned in that direction, and if it was nothing but the steward with new dishes, or the cupbearer with a supply of wine of higher flavour than the last, they again looked down in sadness and disappointment, while the flashes of wit and merriment which had been passing at times from one to another were extinguished by tears of mournful remembrance. The bride was the least thoughtful of the company, and therefore the most happy, but even to her it sometimes seemed strange that she should be sitting at the head of the table, wearing a green wreath and gold-embroidered robe, while Undine was lying a corpse, stiff and cold, at the bottom of the Danube, or carried out by the current into the ocean. For ever since her father had suggested something of this sort, his words were continually sounding in her ear, and this day in particular they would neither fade from her memory nor yield to other thoughts. Evening had scarcely arrived when the company returned to their homes, not dismissed by the impatience of the bridegroom, as wedding parties are sometimes broken up, but constrained solely by heavy sadness and forebodings of evil. Bertalda retired with her maidens, and the knight with his attendants, to undress, but there was no gay laughing company of bridesmaids and bridesmen at this mournful festival. Bertalda wished to awaken more cheerful thoughts. She ordered her maidens to spread before her a brilliant set of jewels, a present from Huldbrand, together with rich apparel and veils, that she might select from among them the brightest and most beautiful for her dress in the morning. The attendants rejoiced at this opportunity of pouring forth good wishes and promises of happiness to their young mistress, and failed not to extol the beauty of the bride with the most glowing eloquence. This went on for a long time, until Bertalda at last, looking in a mirror, said with a sigh, "Ah, but do you not see plainly how freckled I am growing? Look here, on the side of my neck." They looked at the place, and found the freckles, indeed as their fair mistress had said, but they called them mere beauty spots, the faintest touches of the sun, such as would only heighten the whiteness of her delicate complexion. Bertalda shook her head, and still viewed them as a blemish. "And I could remove them," she said at last, sighing, but the castle fountain is covered, from which I formerly used to have that precious water, so purifying to the skin. Oh, had I this evening only a single flask of it!" "Is that all?" cried an alert waiting-maid, laughing as she glided out of the apartment. "She will not be so foolish," said Bertalda, well pleased and surprised, "as to cause the stone cover of the fountain to be taken off this very evening." That instant they heard the tread of men passing along the courtyard, and could see from the window where the officious maiden was leading them directly up to the fountain, and that they carried levers and other instruments on their shoulders. "It is certainly my will," said Bertalda with a smile, "if it does not take them too long." And pleased with the thought that a word from her was now sufficient to accomplish what had formerly been refused with a painful reproof, she looked down upon their operations in the bright moonlit castle court. The men raised the enormous stone with an effort. Some one of the number, indeed, would occasionally sigh when he recollected they were destroying the work of their former beloved mistress. Their labour, however, was much lighter than they had expected. It seemed as if some power from within the fountain itself aided them in raising the stone. "It appears," said the workmen to one another in astonishment, "as if the confined water had become a springing fountain." And the stone rose more and more, and almost without the assistance of the workpeople, rolled slowly down upon the pavement with a hollow sound. But an appearance from the opening of the fountain filled them with awe, as it rose like a white column of water. At first they imagined it really to be a fountain, until they perceived the rising form to be a pale female veiled in white. She wept bitterly, raised her hands above her head, wringing them sadly, as with slow and solemn step she moved toward the castle. The servants shrank back and fled from the spring, while the bride, pale and motionless with horror, stood with her maidens at the window. When the figure had now come close beneath their room, it looked up to them, sobbing, and Bertalda thought she recognized through the veil the pale features of Undine. But the mourning form passed on, sad, reluctant, and lingering, as if going to the place of execution. Bertalda screamed to her maids to call the knight. Not one of them dared to stir from her place, and even the bride herself became again mute, as if trembling at the sound of her own voice. While they continued standing at the window, motionless as statues, the mysterious wanderer had entered the castle, ascended the well-known stairs, and traversed the well-known halls in silent tears. Alas, how different had she once passed through these rooms! The knight had in the meantime dismissed his attendants. Half undressed and in deep dejection, he was standing before a large mirror. A wax taper burned dimly beside him. At this moment someone tapped at his door, very, very softly. Undine had formerly tapped in this way, when she was playing some of her endearing wiles. "It is all an illusion," said he to himself. I must to my nuptial bed." "You must indeed, but to a cold one," he heard a voice, choked with sobs, repeat from without, and then he saw in the mirror that the door of his room was slowly, slowly opened, and the white figure entered and gently closed it behind her. "They have opened the spring," said she in a low tone. "Now I am here. You must die." He felt in his failing breath that this must indeed be, but covering his eyes with his hands, he cried, "Do not, in my death hour, do not make me mad with terror. If that veil conceals hideous features, do not lift it. Take my life, but let me not see you." "Alas," replied the pale figure, "will you not, then, look upon me once more? I am as fair now as when you wooed me on the island." "Oh, if it indeed were so," sighed Hildebrand, "and that I might die by a kiss from you." "Most willingly, my own love," said she. She threw back her veil. Heavenly fair shone forth her pure countenance. Trembling with love and the awe of approaching death, the knight leaned towards her. She kissed him with a holy kiss, but she relaxed not her hold, pressing him more closely in her arms, and weeping as if she would weep away her soul. Tears rushed into the knight's eyes, while a thrill both of bliss and agony shot through his heart, until he at last expired, sinking softly back from her fair arms upon the pillow of his couch, a corpse. "I have wept him to death," said she to some domestics who met her in the antechamber. Passing through the terrified group, she went slowly out and disappeared in the fountain. Chapter 10. Father Heilmann had returned to the castle as soon as the death of the Lord of Ringstetten was made known in the neighborhood, and he arrived at the very hour when the monk who had married the unfortunate couple was hurrying from the door, overcome with dismay and horror. When Father Heilmann was informed of this, he replied, "It is all well, and now come the duties of my office, in which I have no need of an assistant." He then began to console the bride, now a widow, though with little benefit to her worldly and thoughtless spirit. The old fisherman, on the other hand, though severely afflicted, was far more resigned to the fate of his son-in-law and daughter, and while Bertalda could not refrain from accusing Undine as a murderess and sorceress, the old man calmly said, "After all, it could not happen otherwise. I see nothing in it but the judgment of God. And no one's heart was more pierced by the death of Huldbrand than she who was obliged to work it, the poor forsaken Undine." He then assisted in arranging the funeral solemnities as suited the rank of the deceased. The knight was to be interred in the village churchyard, in whose consecrated ground were the graves of his ancestors. a place which they, as well as himself, had endowed with rich privileges and gifts. His shield and helmet lay upon the coffin, ready to be lowered with it into the grave. For Lord Huldbrand of Ringstetten had died the last of his race. The mourners began their sorrowful march, chanting their melancholy songs beneath the calm, unclouded heaven. Father Heilmann preceded the procession, bearing a high crucifix, while the inconsolable Bertalda followed, supported by her aged father. Then they suddenly saw, in the midst of the mourning females and the widow's train, a snow-white figure, closely veiled and wringing its hands in the wild vehemence of sorrow. Those next to whom it moved, seized with a secret dread, started back or on one side, and owing to their movements, the others, next to whom the white stranger now came, were terrified still more, so as to produce confusion in the funeral train. Some of the military escort ventured to address the figure, and attempt to remove it from the procession, but it seemed to vanish from under their hands, and yet was immediately seen advancing again, with slow and solemn step, among the followers of the body. At last, in consequence of the shrinking away of the attendants, it came close behind Bertalda. It now moved so slowly that the widow was not aware of its presence, and it walked meekly and humbly behind her, undisturbed. This continued until they came to the churchyard, where the procession formed a circle round the open grave. Then it was that Bertalda perceived her unbidden companion, and half in anger and half in terror she commanded her to depart from the knight's place of final rest. But the veiled female, shaking her head with a gentle denial, raised her hands towards Bertalda in lowly supplication, by which she was greatly moved, and could not but remember with tears how Undine had shown such sweetness of spirit on the Danube when she held out to her the coral necklace. Father Heilmann now motioned with his hand and gave order for all to observe perfect stillness, that they might breathe a prayer of silent devotion over the body, upon which earth had already been thrown. Bertalda knelt without speaking, and all knelt, even the gravediggers, who had now finished their work. But when they arose, the white stranger had disappeared. On the spot where she had knelt, a little spring of silver brightness was gushing out from the green turf, and it kept swelling and flowing onward with a low murmur, till it almost encircled the mound of the knight's grave. It then continued its course and emptied itself into a calm lake which lay by the side of the consecrated ground. Even to this day, the inhabitants of the village point out the spring and hold fast the belief that it is the poor deserted Undine, who in this manner still fondly encircles her beloved in her arms. The end.